John Bambenek, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel TV, and we are going to be discussing a very critical issue I think a lot of Americans have yet to focus on, and it is the degree to which our American infrastructure that all of us count on, our electricity, our water, our transportation systems, are under attack in a way that Americans think that we're impervious to attack, but these days we are no longer impervious because we can be attacked through cyber attacks. And before we start our conversation, you being a cybersecurity expert, I want to set up our conversation with a clip by the FBI director who just about 2 weeks ago testified before a House committee on the dangers that Americans are facing from cyber attacks from China.
There has been far too little public focus on the fact that PRC hackers are targeting our critical infrastructure, our water treatment plants, our electrical grid, our oil and natural gas pipelines, our transportation systems, and the risk that poses to every American requires our attention now. China's hackers are positioning on American infrastructure in preparation to wreak havoc and cause real-world harm to American citizens and communities if and when China decides the time has come to strike.
So there you go, FBI Director Christopher Wray telling Congress how Americans' infrastructure is being targeted and targeted in a very critical way. What is your reaction, John, when you hear that, knowing what you know?
I mean, usually, when you start getting public statements like that, they know more than they can let on, but it's part of a broader focus. The week after that, on February 7th, CISA, the Federal Civilian Agency for Cybersecurity, released a more detailed report on PRC-linked hackers inside critical infrastructure. And it's to highlight the threat, right? Because they're not creating real-world impact, but they're in a place where they could do so quite trivially. And unlike many countries in the world, the United States has kind of a unique problem that so much of our critical infrastructure is in the private sector's hands, where it's not like the federal government can come in and do things, right? We have a Bill of Rights, but our society relies on that. So you've got big companies like Exelon, you've got smaller agencies like in Springfield, City Water, Light and Power, that have to protect themselves against nation-state threats, but aren't really government agencies, so you don't have the same kind of resources to bear to protect themselves.
When I heard this, sometimes I've heard people talk about different catastrophic things that might happen and the survivalist kind of thing, and people tend to mock some of these people as being extremists because they're stocking up, with a year's supply of food and all this other stuff. But when I hear this cyber attack coming from the FBI director, this warning to Congress that, it seems to me that something that all of us should be doing is having some supply of food and water stored so that if there was a cyber attack that, say, took out some critical infrastructure, like the grid, for a 2-week period or even a month period, it seems to me that, grocery stores are going to have a difficult time restocking the shelves, much less just having any refrigeration if the grid is down, and if it's going to be down for some period of time, as I say, for 2 weeks or a month, then all of us are going to have to be relying on our own and better have some kind of backup. Is that something that you think is warranted, or am I overstating the case?
If there was a scenario where a foreign power engaged in that level of attack, right, we're in an active war, right, and not in the sense of, hey, there's a conflict going around, say, for instance, what's going on in Israel and the Gaza Strip, we're involved, but it's not a war impacting the United States, right? It's a very different scenario. But, emergency services agencies and the like say, you should have some measure to of supplies and equipment in the case of an emergency. It doesn't necessarily even need to be a cyber attack. We see it with weather events. We've seen it with the pandemic, really. The pandemic is another great example of kind of a long-term emergency event in which some of the things that we do to provide for ourselves were no longer possible, and we adapted. So I think on one hand, certainly it's scary threats, but on the flip side, Americans as a class are resourceful people, and we find our way around problems as long as we have the wherewithal to face challenges and meet them.
When we hear this coming from the FBI director, and as you said, he's only really maybe telling us, scratching the surface, that there's going to be more that he knows. Last time you and I spoke, was several years ago, you actually were in Strasbourg, France, attending a NATO security meeting. And I say that for the audience's sake, that you're not just a backyard guy with a computer. I mean, you're an expert in this field. Mm-hmm. How prepared is, in your estimation, the United States against these attacks, or our Western European partners? To what extent are we okay because we can fight back in a cyber war, or are we, woefully outmanned?
I mean, we're outmanned to the sense of, no company really wants to spend a lot of money on cybersecurity. No entity is in the business to keep their computers safe. They're in the business to provide power, provide water, provide transportation, moving goods from place to place. In a situation where there's great disruption, there'll be a period of time of catching up, and we've seen examples of that, right? Colonial Pipeline a year or two ago, right, as a fuel pipeline in the Eastern Corridor that was disrupted from a cyber attack. Doesn't look like it was intended as a critical infrastructure attack, just a conventional criminal one, but gas stopped flowing from point A to point B. You saw big price spikes and supply chain issues. We're still struggling with supply chain issues that started in the pandemic. And much of our political discourse right now is talking about inflation, and a good chunk of that is tied to supply chain disruptions, especially now, with the conflict in Israel and what some of the Houthis are doing in Yemen and disrupting maritime operations. These do have real world impact, primarily in cost. But, if we're talking about the PRC, and if they want to engage in a conflict in earnest, probably the catalyst, if I had to predict, would be they decide to get serious with their words about reclaiming Taiwan as their own, and decide to disrupt the United States and the West in helping Taiwan with attacks to our critical infrastructure, where our resources are taxed, focusing on that problem instead of providing arms to Taiwan, much in the same way of how Ukraine has managed to fend off the Russian Federation for as long as it has because of Western help. I think China noticed that, and when and if they decide to reclaim Taiwan, I imagine that's what we're going to see here in the West. If we're struggling to keep our power grid up and getting food going from point A to point B, I think we can overcome that problem relying on offline means. They'd be more expensive, they'd be slower, they'd be inefficient, there'd be problems, but we'd get past it. But that's where our national focus would be, and we'd be unable to focus on the broader geopolitical aims that we would have in that region of the world.
To your, given your knowledge, is there a backup plan that you're aware of that within? I think FEMA is part of the Plan B in case there was a major cyber, I should say, attack. So to your knowledge, are we preparing for that just in case? And, I'm old enough, I remember as a kid during the Kennedy administration, we used to have air raid shelters in case of a nuclear war, where you could go and they'd have bottled water and crackers or something you could eat and, be down there. We had some plan B. Maybe it was fallacious. Maybe it wouldn't have really protected us, but at least gave us some idea that the government was reacting to the threat. Are we reacting to the threat?
Yeah, I mean, you make an example, right? Some of the Plan B or the visibility of the public of Plan B was Cold War era nuclear war stuff, right? If Washington, D.C. was nuked, how would we continue as a country? And certainly a lot of that Plan B is how the government is going to have continuity of operations. But aspects of that is how is the government going to prevent the breakdown of society, right? Because at a certain point, if I don't have access to food or water, humanity tends to very quickly resort to violence in the absence of alternatives to feeding your family, right? And that is a bad outcome. So there is lots of Plan B, and a lot of that has been shaped by Cold War era, like, hey, something just got nuked, and that has radical impact countrywide, aside of ground zero and fallout. And there were aspects of that plan that were enacted at the early start of the pandemic as there was concerns about the social order. Uh, so, for cyber attacks generally, right? For critical infrastructure, really, we're talking about how will society keep operating, and healthcare, for instance. Actually, we've seen that in Springfield with HSHS, who had ransomware a few months back.
I'm going to have you froze up there for a minute.
Okay. I'm
Okay,
back.
now you're
Browser
okay.
just
Now you're
refreshed.
okay. Let's pick it up. You're talking about the hospital.
Yeah. So a few months back, HSHS had ransomware, and their infrastructure was offline, right? So electronic health records, billing, scheduling, time management, payroll. But we still had, or I should say, there was still some institutional memory of, hey, well, let's just chart on paper. The provision of healthcare continued, albeit inefficiently, right? Because there's a lot of advantages, cost reduction being one, of doing things electronically, but we still know how to do things manually and on paper, right? If transportation were attacked in a way that disrupted the cyber means to manage maritime operations, we still know how to do things manually if we had to. So in a lot of these ways, we would just resort to, more costly, more inefficient ways of continuing things anyway, right? So the plan B for a massive cyber attack is to ditch the computers and do things by hand again. And there's enough memory of how to do that throughout the economy to at least keep things going, until normal operations can be restored.
A number of years ago, I spoke with then Congressman Mike Rogers, who was the head of the House Intelligence Committee. And when he was talking about cyber attacks, it wasn't this random attack that came in. He goes, America's being attacked thousands of times or tens of thousands every day from China, from North Korea, from Iran, from Russia. Christopher Wray said in testimony of that same hearing we heard the clip from, he said that the Chinese outgun, he said, we Americans have the best cyber infrastructure or ability. We're the best cyber guys in this warfare of cyber attacks. But the Chinese alone outman the FBI cyber team by 50 or 100 to 1. So it makes you realize maybe we're just going to be overwhelmed. I mean, and the threat to the American homeland is no longer warfare like we often imagine, as if it's World War II, where we're protected by the Atlantic and the Pacific. Now we're all connected to this wonderful thing called the internet that allows you and I to be talking to one another, and so much more. But it also opens the door to threats that we've never had. Let me ask you, when we talk about, I spoke about FEMA and that there is some plan B, that fortunately the federal government is anticipating this, and what would we do in case? Is that also being coordinated at the state level, or places like Illinois, or cities being brought in and saying, hey, you need to have a cyber meltdown plan just in case this happens?
Yeah, no, and when you hear the federal government and CISA and DHS talk about public-private partnerships, that's what they're talking about. So, I mean, there's elements of state and local government that need to be involved. and there's elements of the private sector that need to be involved, right? Is in a major catastrophic event affecting cybersecurity or digital infrastructure, I personally would have a role to play in helping remediate that. There are other professionals in similar places, because at the end of the day, more hands are going to be needed, right? If you have a situation like that, it's all hands on deck, and skill levels, or the skills exist in the private sector, and it's a lot more than the public sector just by raw numbers. So yeah, there's elements that your local sheriff is aware of. There's elements that FEMA directors are aware of. There's the State Emergency Operations Center. They would coordinate. If there was impact beyond a county level, right? If there's multiple cities or counties being involved, there's already a state center for that to coordinate the level as far as the state of Illinois is concerned. There's fusion centers if it involves, something more kinetic like terrorism, right? There's the State Terrorism Information Center. So there are agencies that exist essentially in bunkers that are protected and isolated to at least do the coordination of the personnel and logistics to get us back to standing.
Hopefully they have talking about all the cyber people working in the private sector corporations. If the grid went down, if we had to undo an attack, cyber attack, one would hope there's a list of these people who would be critical, like all hands on deck. You have to know how to get a hold of them. And I also would say, as far as our emergency people, whether it's fire or police, if the phone system is down, hopefully they have thought through, maybe we just need the old walkie-talkies so that we could still have them coordinating things and not be, out of the game. Just like they did, back in the 50s, where they had radios in their car, they could be in touch with the home base. Let me ask you, what's different when we hear this threat about foreign adversaries, as the FBI director talked about? Before, a lot of times people would say, think about your home computer and what kind of anti-hacking software should you have on your personal computer. But this is different. This is the grid. This is, the transportation system. So is there anything that someone listening to this can do personally, aside from maybe having some stored food in cans and rice and, bottled water or something just in case? Is there anything they can do to protect themselves from cyber attacks? Or, when we're talking about the whole infrastructure of the country, I don't know really what more they can be prepared for.
I don't know that there's a very easy path to say, compromising a bunch of individuals to then create a major infrastructure impact, like to the power grid, right? There's certainly a lot of direct attacks towards individuals that have a lot of outsized impact of, we talk about generative AI. Was it last week or the week before? All of the synthetic, we'll call it erotic materials about Taylor Swift, right? So we've got these tools for doing new modern forms of sexual harassment that we've done forever, right? But the skill level for that exists on almost every high school in America, and you've got young women and girls who are victims of this all the time. Certainly, that's an impact. I don't know that you can tie it to critical infrastructure as much, but every school, I shouldn't say every school, every year there's schools that deal with kids doing denial of service attacks, trying to knock off the grading system or get out of finals or delay finals. So there is small stuff. But to your broader point, what can an individual do? I mean, I think the guidance that emergency services provide is like, yeah, you want to make sure you've got food for a couple of days, flashlights, candles, in case there are disruptions for any reason, right? I don't know that if I care if I'm an individual, the lights are out for 3 years, what the cause is, right? I got to keep my family warm and fed, right? And the response is basically the same in all those circumstances. Is to do what you can for a couple of days until the emergency action plans kick in to restore basic service. As much as possible, don't panic, right? Panic takes any problem and just magnifies it.
As basic as it is, maybe have a couple of candles, because it's, at least you can see your way around the house at night.
Yeah, and be careful that the candles are someplace that won't start fires, right?
Right. And I would say a friend of mine, back when Hurricane Sandy, I think it was, hit New York City, this was roughly 10, 12 years ago, and she called me, even though the electricity was out in the city, and I said, "How are you calling me?" Well, her husband had gone out to a local electronics store previous to this happening and got a little solar unit that would produce enough electricity you could keep your cell phone charged up. So sometimes it's something as simple as that. You could do that, and that's not really terribly expensive. Now, some of the survivalists have, solar arrays that are in the thousands of dollars that could probably keep your refrigerator going and your whole house lit up. I guess it all depends how much you want to spend to be prepared.
Well, I mean, the mercenary way of looking at that problem, if we're talking about the breakdown of society where I've got to provide my own power and food for years on end, well, those houses are the ones that get robbed first.
Hey, their lights are on.
Yeah, their lights are on. I bet they've got food. Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you're talking about the return to the Middle Ages, where humanity has to take its books and go up to the mountains for a couple of decades to then come down to rebuild society, I guess there's only so much you can do aside of keeping your books dry. But for shorter periods of time, right, it's a fair expectation the government has here, have some food on hand, have some flashlights, older forms of this guidance that had a weather radio that they can do emergency announcements on and let you know things.
And like you say, batteries are always good to have.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, one of the big things, the big new wave, which is clearly going to happen, and I'm putting this on the level of just as the internet came in the 90s, which changed the world. That's why we're talking about this. But the new wave is artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. Does this factor into our conversation, artificial intelligence? And let's just say, let's throw it out in general to you, as a security expert, does this present solutions or more problems, the wave of artificial intelligence coming in?
To be honest, I think it creates more problems. The fundamental cybersecurity problem is that how do I have computers, process untrusted data? And we haven't solved that problem that we've been aware of since the 80s and 90s. AI is just going to make the problem radically faster and more apparent. And I've made reference to one example of the kind of generative AI used for sexual harassment we see on Taylor Swift. She wasn't the first by far, but, has resources, public presence, a bully pulpit of sorts. We all became aware of it. A couple of weeks ago, also, to the New Hampshire presidential primaries, there was a robocall using the generative voice of Joe Biden, right? And the FCC yesterday, I think, outlawed the use of AI in robocalls. I should say regulated, not outlawed. But, the point being the same is, we're starting to come to grips with how these tools will be used to create problems and mischief. I don't know how that would link to, say critical infrastructure as a whole, but certainly there's a lot of personal impact to be done. It can be used in romance scams, for instance. You think you're, on Tinder, Bumble, trying to find companionship, which many people do, and it's somebody who's using these tools to more effectively exploit you, and either some form of extortion or theft.
Yeah. I tell people these days I can take the image off the internet of someone video. I can take their voice, and through artificial intelligence that already exists, I could have a press conference with John F. Kennedy, talking about issues in 2024 with his voice and his image responding. It's so, I talk about this, which is not really about cyber attacks, but it could be an attack on democracy when we put out some, as you were just saying, you could have a political candidate saying something horrible, whatever it would be, and people may not know, oh, well, that was created, it's not real. So that's something I think the U.S. Congress is going to have to grapple with, that we're going to have some sort of a criminal sanctions that, or say anytime you create something that's not real, it has to be labeled with some kind of a marker so people know this is no longer real, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it runs into some interesting First Amendment questions. It runs into a lot of problems that I don't think there aren't any easy solutions, right? It's unclear of, with generative content, right? How much artistic license does the First Amendment allow you when you're just giving a prompt versus a painter painting a parody?
Yeah, I mean, it might be fun to have an Elvis commercial during the Super Bowl where his family is being compensated for the use of his image and all. But you also got to worry about, the fact that everyone's going to have to be a little more critical in their thinking about, is this even real or has this been created? So before
I think that's the problem. I think even maybe 6 years ago, I was with U of I, had two student researchers. One created a generative AI system where I would move and talk, and it would be Hillary Clinton, right? It would just, basically generated an image of Hillary Clinton using my mannerisms. So you see my hands moving, it would be Hillary Clinton's hands. The only problem with that system, it didn't know how to process the facial hair, so it'd be Hillary Clinton with a beard, But once we fixed that problem, I had another team. All right, how would you algorithmically detect this in technology?
Well, I don't know if people have seen. There's some of these little clips. They're innocent, but they're with Tom Cruise.
Tom Cruise,
And it's not real Tom Cruise. It's a guy, as you were saying, moving, who looks like Tom Cruise. So the software doesn't have to take someone like me and make him Tom Cruise. It's a guy that has similar bone structure and all. But you cannot distinguish. It looks exactly like the Tom Cruise we know.
Right. So when you get to that class of people, I mean, you mentioned one thing, right? Actors, if you're making money using their representation, they're due the money, right? There's a way to go to court for that. When you're the president, you've got an entire agency called the Secret Service who pays people visits when they do, obnoxious things regarding you. So that robocall impersonating Joe Biden, right? They're going to find that guy. But that kind of AI generated imagery, there was a business a week or two ago that lost millions of dollars because somebody joined a video call, impersonating the CEO, said, here, send this money, to wherever. Looks like the boss, sounds like the boss. They just acted on what they thought was a legitimate request from the boss, and turned out it wasn't, right? And the money's out the door.
It's almost like people are going to have start developing secret passwords. So in a conversation, you could say, what's the secret password so I know it's you?
Right.
Because otherwise you get a call and it sounds like your mom or your dad or your child.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's kind of a similar take on an earlier point. I don't know if this is true in Springfield. I know it's in Champaign County. The title companies for real estate closings, they've gone back to checks and passing checks at closing. There's no more wiring money in an escrow, anything like that, because too many people have been burned by getting, fake email about, oh, hey, the closing's going to be Monday. Wire the money here instead of there. And it's the largest economic transaction most people ever do. And if your down payment's gone, then all of a sudden you're at the closing. Hey, why isn't any money in the escrow? Oh, it's already left the country. Sorry. So, for real estate, they've gone back to the old ways because you can't compromise that from another continent.
Let me ask before we close out, I'm sure you got to keep your fingers on the pulse of your industry like everyone does. Doctors have to look at what new technology is coming out to advance medicine. What are the main topics in the world of a cybersecurity expert that you focus on or that the industry is kind of looking at?
Certainly, you talk about AI, that's been the hot topic of the last year or so, and it just so happened coincidentally that's what I'm getting my PhD in, is cybersecurity, artificial intelligence. So just by accident of circumstance, I just happened to be, in that field before it became popular. But there's people who specialize in different things because there's just too much, right? The security issues affecting the power grid are very different than the security issues affecting the financial services industry, right? Fraud versus, nation states trying to engage in sabotage and disruption of civil society. There's people who focus on the threats to the individual of romance scams that we just made reference to, but that alone is billions of dollars of lost per year of fraud events. So I mean, it's real money that goes out the door, and there's, in reality, as I said, there's too many problems for one person to keep up with, right? You specialize in a couple of things. I tend to focus on high-end cybercrime and now artificial intelligence. And there's no shortage of work.
I can imagine, and in your world, I would imagine you could have clients who are down the street or on the other side of the planet.
Mm-hmm. About 25% of my business is international, Europe and Asia mostly, a little bit of South America, not much in Africa yet, for reasons that are probably self-evident, but that's also a place that needs a lot of help too.
Well, John, I think we've probably done as much damage as we can on this topic for one setting, but we appreciate you sharing your thoughts. And if there's other things, I didn't want to go too far afield, maybe down the road we can follow up in this election year, because the Illinois Department of Board of Elections was hacked a couple of years ago. That was a 60-minute piece, I think, by the Russians. So cybersecurity and election integrity are also issues that are on the minds of people, especially in this election year. So maybe we can come back and pick your brain on what are those issues and what are false fears and what are things that we should really be concerned about. But we'll leave that for next time. In the meantime, thanks so much, John. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.